For those of us that may not have been with me on the last Sunday morning Bible study, it's been a little while now. I wrote a bunch of notes, and I went off on fire, and then I ran off to the hospital. It feels like it's been an age to me. It may have gone quickly for some of you, but to me it feels like quite a long time. What we started on was a study on the life of Christ. And I'll just hold up this book, the only copy of this book that I have. We're basing our study on this book, which was written by H.B. Frank Jr. I received this book from H.B.'s son, who is a preacher within the church. And his father, who wrote this book, was also a preacher in the church, and more so, he was specifically a missionary. He traveled the world, despite he and his wife having suffered from polio and being severely limited in their mobility. This book has been used previously at Christian universities, and H.B. Frank Jr. himself actually taught from this while he was doing missionary work in England. And when his son, who currently preaches, gave me this book, he had the thought in mind that maybe it would be of benefit to me. I had explained to him that I was doing a little bit of studying and was doing some Bible study. And he said, you know, this you might find this to be of benefit. And as I started reading it, I realized it's a very sound commentary of the life of Jesus. He gives in here basically a chronological order of his life, but more so than that, it gives historical and cultural background. So the idea in our study is not to just understand history, but to get a picture of what the times were like in Jesus' time. Why did he say some of the things that he did? Why did he interact with the peoples that he did in the way that he did? It will give us a better flavor of the background to why Jesus did some of the things that he did, helping us to comprehend Jesus' character. And hopefully we can gain more insight into the scriptures that we read in the New Testament as well as the Old. And so having ultimately a closer relationship with Jesus as the author of our salvation. So that is the premise of what I would like to convey from this book. We really started in chapter 1 last time. We didn't fully finish it. And I'll give you a brief synopsis since it's been a few weeks, I'll give you a brief synopsis of what we covered before we go into the next topic. We established last time that the coming Messiah was planned even before the creation of the world. You can reference that in 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 18 through 20. And if you're listening or taking notes, I'll mention a few scriptures. You can write them down and read those later. We also talked a little bit about the prophecies that took place for hundreds of years and for centuries prior to Christ. We talked a little bit about what the fullness of time means in Galatians chapter 4, verse 4, and how it is God's appointed time. And when Jesus came at the time that he did, there were certain factors that made it ripe for his coming. So, for example, the Jews had already been widely dispersed. They'd already gone into exile and had been dispersed far and wide. We had the rise of synagogue worship following the Babylonian exile. There was contact with the Greek culture, and the Greek culture was important because of the language, the Koine Greek that was used to write the New Testament. So therefore you have this universal Greek language that was limited in scope and time and did not have a chance to morph into a much different type of language over time. For example, in English, if you were to go back to the Middle Age English, we would probably barely be able to understand what people were saying back then, and it's technically our language. Another thing that was very helpful was that the Roman Empire at this time was in a very stable state. There were good roads, so the news could be traveled along on good roads. One thing I think someone mentioned after our last class were the aqueducts. So you had well-established plumbing. So we're in an advanced culture that where news could travel well on established roads, where you had an advanced civilization. We had stability from that. And we also had the expectation. People were expecting a Messiah. The Jews were expecting a Messiah. We talked a little bit about the political situation in Palestine of the day and gave a little bit of background about the Maccabean period. And remember Judas Maccabeus? He helped the Jews to win liberty from an autocratic Syrian king who wanted to destroy the Jewish religion. Pop quiz, does anyone remember the word Hellenistic? Any guess as to what that might refer to? What is Hellenistic?
Military people.
Hellenistic is simply a fancy way of saying late Greek culture. So from the time that Alexander the Great died until the time when the first Roman Emperor Octavian defeated Cleopatra and Mark Antony in about 30 BC, 31 BC, you've got several hundred years of late Greek culture. And Hellenistic simply refers to that late Greek culture, to its language, to its history, to the general customs and traditions of the day. And the Syrian king that the Maccabeans revolted against, the Syrian king Antiochus IV was his name. And he did everything he could to wipe out the Jewish religion. He outlawed Sabbaths, festivals. He ordered the destruction of scriptures. And the straw that broke the camel's back for the Jews that led to the revolt was when he sacrificed swine at their temple on the altar. And of course, we know from the Old Testament, you can write these scriptures down, Leviticus 11, verse 7, and Deuteronomy 14, verse 8. We know from those scriptures that in the Old Testament, swine was not a clean animal. And so it was really the ultimate insult to do what he did by desecrating the temple with, swine on the altar. And so that ultimately really was the last straw that led to the Jewish revolt, and they won their independence in 167 BC. And that independence lasted for approximately 100 years or so. And when they won their independence, we talked about last time, there was this thing called, they developed a festival in memorial of this independence called the Feast of Dedication or the Feast of Lights. Note John chapter 10, verse 22 speaks to that. You'll see Feast of Dedication or Feast of Lights in your Bibles. We know that today as Hanukkah. And so during this Maccabean period within which they had freedom, things changed a little bit. The appointment to the high priest used to be a traditional hereditary type of appointment. Now it became a little bit more political. And there were leverages for power. There were bribes. We also see some of the Jewish sects of Jesus' day start to form at this time. So the Pharisees, the Sadducees, you've all heard of these groups. They started developing during this time pre-Jesus, during this, post-freedom Maccabean period. And they actually took opposing sides. They didn't agree on all things. The Sadducees, for example, were more open to intermingling with foreigners. The Pharisees separated themselves more. I'll get more into their differences in a little bit. And then around 63 BC or so, we start to see the Roman influence in this Syrian area where the Jews were. And Herod the Great also became a power as a result of it, because this would be just about the time where Rome was becoming truly an empire as opposed to a republic. We had this Roman general, his name was Pompey. He first arrived in the area, the Syrian area, which we also call Palestine, of which Jerusalem is the capital. So it's all in this same geographic area. And so this area became subject to Rome at about that time. And they would appoint governors or procurators over this area. And so that's what happened at this time. You can see a reference to this in Luke chapter 2 in the first 2 verses. And so this is what Jesus was born into. He was born into an area that was already under Roman rule through basically a governor or procurator type of official. However, you still have the Jews mixed in too, and we'll get to that in a moment. And then you've all heard of the Herods. There is one called Herod the Great, and following the death of his father, he became king. And he began rebuilding the second temple. So you had Solomon who built the temple. Well, that was destroyed. It was rebuilt. And then during Antiochus, the guy who basically spurred the Jewish revolt, he had destroyed the temple. So now we've got Herod the Great trying to rebuild the rebuild. And a lot of that was completed in his lifetime, but not completely. And so we noted that Herod was a really bad guy. He basically had no qualms about killing family members in order to retain power. And that was pretty typical of this era as a way of maintaining control. The governors and procurators over certain areas within the Roman Empire, they acted very much the same way too, a lot of times. So I've talked about the temple a little bit, so let's go into the religious climate. So that covers a little bit of the politics, but now we're going to enter into the next topic, which is the religious climate of the area. And I know I'm giving you a lot of history here, but it's important to understand this history and this background if we're to understand why Christ did the things that he did in his time. So I mentioned Solomon's temple. Well, that was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC. Okay? Then they did rebuild that temple, and the rebuild of that was completed in 516 by Zerubbabel. So this is a new temple, also known as the Second Temple. So Solomon built the first one. It was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. They built a new one. And so they did pretty good work between 586 and 516. Within 100 years, they were able to build the Second Temple. Well, I mentioned King Antiochus. He had plundered and destroyed it. Obviously, did more than just desecrate it with swine. And so that's when Herod the Great started rebuilding that Second Temple. And he started that around 19 to 20 BC, when he started that. I won't give you all the details about the temple, but I'll give you some idea about how it was used. The outer court of the temple itself was primarily used for Gentiles. It was also used as a marketplace. We can see that in the book of John. I've got too much stuff here. I'm going to set that aside. Let's take a moment and turn to a scripture now and just see that example. We all know that, but let's turn with me to John chapter 2. And if somebody wouldn't mind reading, could somebody read verses 14 through 16?
In the temple, he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons. and the money changers sitting there, and making a whip of cords. He drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and oxen, and poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned the tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade."
Okay, so it was used as a marketplace. What can we read here about Jesus' reaction to that? What can we infer from that?
Madness.
Pardon?
He was mad.
He was mad about that, yes.
He was saying, "You den of thieves."
That's right.
In one way.
Make not my Father's house a house of merchandise. So, yes, it was used as a marketplace, but Jesus did not approve of that.
But he didn't approve because of what they were doing. They were selling pigeons in place of doves, and they were using, overpricing stuff to take advantage of what they were supposed to be doing for God.
So it was a place of greed.
Greed.
Mm-hmm.
Which was the den of thieves.
Women also worshipped at the temple too. We don't speak a lot about women in these times because it doesn't, the Bible is actually surprisingly full of verses about women and devout and chaste women, those who were very strong in the faith and devoted to God. But they worshipped at the temple too. If we turn over to, let's take a look at Mark. Let's go back to the book of Mark. We'll go to chapter 12. Take a look at starting in verse 41. If somebody else wouldn't mind reading Mark chapter 12, starting in verse 41. And we'll remember this story pretty well. Jeff, could I ask you to read?
Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowds putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins, worth only a fraction of a penny. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "I tell you the truth, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live."
Okay, so we see women at the temple too. I'll give you one more verse. Roger, would you mind turning to Luke chapter 2, just a few pages ahead? Luke chapter 2, verse 37. In fact, you might read 36 and 37.
And there was one, my eyes focused here. One, Anna, a prophetess, the daughter of Phanuel of the tribe of Asher. She was of great age, having lived with a husband 7 years from her virginity. Verse 37, and she had been a widow even unto 84 years, who departed not from the temple, worshiping with fasting and supplication night and day.
So we see 2 examples here of women at the temple, and in the case of Anna here, she departed not from the temple. She served God night and day. This is, when women are spoken of in the Bible, oftentimes there's something very profound to gather from it. And in this case, she gives us all a great example of how the faithful should be. So we see women at the temple. Typically, they were limited to the eastern side of the temple by traditional standard. The inner court of the temple itself was on higher ground than the outer court. So as you're going into the inner parts of the temple, you're going higher up. The sanctuary itself was higher still. You had a flight of 12 steps to get to it. We have heard of the Holy of Holies, or the inner sanctum. This is supposed to be the area where traditionally you would want to put the Ark of the Covenant. And the idea of this Holy of Holies, the inner sanctum, where this sanctuary is that this is where God's very presence resides. So as you're going from the outer temple to the inner part of the temple, you're actually rising. Jesus himself, as well as the apostles, they commonly taught at the temple. This was a common thing to do in the day. I would reference Matthew chapter 26, verse 55, for example. Who else wants to talk? Okay, I'm going this way. I'm going to go to Paul. If you would turn to Matthew chapter 26 and read verse 55. And this is Jesus speaking.
At that hour, Jesus said to the crowds, Have you come out as against a robber, with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me.
So he sat daily teaching at the temple. This is just one example. There are many examples in the Bible. Jesus taught, the apostles taught. But this is a common place. It was the place to teach. The Romans at the time, they did allow the Jews some freedom. In fact, they allowed them to, quote, police the temple in a sense. We can see an example of this in, let's take a look at Acts chapter 4, for example. And if someone doesn't raise your hand, I'm going to pick on you. I didn't even get a smile out of that one. So let's take a look. Acts chapter 4. Anyone want to read that? Go ahead, sir. Chapter 4, verse 1.
Chapter 4, verse 1?
Yes, please.
Okay. And as they were speaking to the people, the priest and the captain of the temple guard and the Sadducees came upon them.
Okay, so this was something, this is just an example of the fact that the Jews would monitor the temple. They would police it, so to speak. They would, if there was somebody there that they didn't think should be there, they would take them out. So the temple was very specific to the Jews, and the Romans, they did not have weren't always looking over the shoulders of the Jews to make sure they were doing everything according to the way they would normally do it. The Romans, their concern was quelling any potential rebellions. That was more of a more of the Roman concern. So the Jews did have, at that time, some freedom over being able to police the temple itself. So there are other examples. For time's sake, I won't go into them. So that's just a brief idea about the temple. Anyone could worship there. There was an area where even the Gentiles, even though it often doubled as a marketplace, would be allowed. And then as you go into the inner parts of the temple, you do rise. It's almost as if you're getting closer to God.
And the Romans would police the outside too. The Romans were policing too, a lot of the outside to keep all this ramble from happening too.
Right. If there were concerns, if the Jews were really upset about something, it would be the responsibility of first the Sanhedrin, which we'll talk about shortly, but is also the Roman governor at the time. He was supposed to ensure that the Jews were in good order, if you will, and not rebelling. So we have another word. We have this word called synagogue. So when you think of the temple, you might also think of the word synagogue. The word synagogue really means bringing together. That's what synagogue means. The origin of the synagogue is been traced to post-Babylonian exile. So prior to exile, they had the temple. When they were exiled, they started getting dispersed. There was really no place to go to worship God. And synagogues started coming into play as a result. They were in lieu of having a temple available. It could be too far to travel. Once the Jews were dispersed in exile, it would have been too far to travel to get to the temple. Maybe people weren't too far away, but they were in poverty and couldn't make it. And so it became a rule of thumb to have at least one in every major city. And it took at least 10 males or 10 men in order to establish a synagogue. There were many synagogues within Jerusalem itself, since Jerusalem was large. So even though there was a temple, so to speak, being rebuilt in Jesus' time, because of it being a big city, it might have been a struggle for everyone to make it there. So there were plenty of synagogues in Jerusalem. The synagogues, they had rulers or elders. You can see that in Luke chapter 13, verse 14, for example. The synagogues were buildings typically structured out of stone. And Paul, the Apostle Paul, would have sought them out. He sought them out as places to teach, just like we mentioned the temple was a place to teach. So were the synagogues. And you can see all through Acts where Paul sought these synagogues out as a place to teach, to spread the gospel. Pharisees, we've all heard of Pharisees. The very name Pharisee means separatist. And we've heard things about the Pharisees. We've heard that they are a strict sect. They were well established by about 135 BC. So remember, after the Maccabees revolted and the Jews won their freedom, and we talked about how some of the Jewish sects started to develop during this time of freedom, the Pharisees are one of them. And so historically it's been documented that by 135 BC they were fairly well established. What were the Pharisees about? What did they try to do? Well, they wanted complete obedience to both oral and written law. That was the essence of what they were. They were also the largest sect of Jews during Jesus' time, according to the Jewish historian Josephus. And so, what did they believe? Well, the Pharisees, they believed in angels, they believed in spirits, they believed in the resurrection, they also believed in the immortal soul. Let's take a quick look in Acts chapter 23. Acts chapter 23, verse 8. And if I could get somebody else to volunteer, whoever gets there first. Acts chapter 23, verse 8.
For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, and no angel or spirit, but the Pharisees confess both.
Okay, so we've learned something additional to what I've just stated here, haven't we? We've not only learned that the Pharisees believe in these things, but we've learned that the Sadducees do not. So, before we get a little bit further into the Sadducees, just note that the Pharisees, they were very influential. Not only were they the largest, but they were very influential in the synagogues particularly, as well as just daily life. You might think of them as sort of the blue-collar folk. They represented the common people. Furthermore, they were very strict about keeping the Sabbath. They did tithe and fast, and they did so meticulously. And if you look at the chapter of Matthew 23, you will see that Jesus addressed Pharisees and Sadducees as primary opposition to his work. Not all Pharisees. Sometimes they've been given the reputation during some of our studies. We'll see when Jesus has his interactions with the Pharisees that he called them things such as hypocrites. Well, just note that they weren't all hypocrites. We can't just broad brush a group of people. They weren't all hypocrites. You might look at folks like Nicodemus or Saul of Tarsus. they weren't all hypocrites. They all firmly believed. Some of them did actually genuinely believe and worship God and try to follow his will. Another thing to note about the Pharisees is post-temple destruction, circa AD 70, the Pharisees, they survived past then. So they were still a Jewish sect beyond the destruction of the temple, where the other sects seem to just dematerialize. You don't really see them in the annals of history. So let's take another look at the Sadducees. We just read a verse about them. They mostly represented the priests as well as that operated in the temple. They were also highly represented in the Sanhedrin. We'll get to the Sanhedrin shortly, but that is basically a council of Jews. It's the high council, if you will. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. They claim, tradition, if you will, this is not scripture, but tradition claims that the Sadducees had their origin from the high priest Zadok, who was under King David. So a lot of them trace their origin back to that high priest Zadok, to the time of King David. Others have claimed that the origin of the Sadducees came from a different Zadok, but a much more recent one. That was about 250 BC, so not as far back as King David. This Zadok would have been a disciple of Antigonus Zacchaeus, and this person would have taught the principle of obedience to God without the expectation of reward. So sometimes, and if taken too far, we need to be very careful of that concept. When we ask God of things, when we pray to God, we need to have faith that God will answer us, even if it's not the way we want to. We have to have faith that we will be rewarded in heaven. And this principle that was taught by that particular Zadok was that we should have obedience to God, but we should not expect any reward for it. And that is very much against the New Testament theology. So the Sadducees, yes, they were less in number than the Pharisees. However, they were known to be wealthy. So a lot of the Sadducees were quite wealthy, and they held political clout. And so this also plays hand in hand with the Sanhedrin, which was high council. So you see a lot of the Sadducees in the high council as well. And as Andrew just read in Acts 23 verse 8, they did not believe in angels and spirit. They did not believe in the resurrection. They did not believe in immortality. And they even rejected the oral traditions that the Pharisees held so meticulously close to. So they were two different sects. They were very much different-minded. There's another one that we read about in the New Testament. It's called the scribes. You've heard of the scribes, right? And since I'm just about out of time, I will take 1 minute and we'll describe the scribes slightly. They were the professional copyists of the time. They were also students of the law. They were considered equal with the priesthood, particularly in religious matters. In your notes, Matthew chapter 2, verse 4. We won't read it for time's sake. But take a look at Matthew chapter 2, verse 4. They were equal in the priesthood in regard to religious matters. They were also called lawyers. They were also called doctors and teachers of the law. Okay, not like a physician doctor, but like a doctor of the law. They also translated Hebrew into the colloquial Aramaic, or the Targum, as it's called. You don't have to remember all this. The main thing is that when people stopped speaking Hebrew, probably around the 6th century BC, they were able to keep translating the scriptures. And so they were also very highly rated in Jewish society. And so you'll see the scribes when Jesus interacts with them as well. And they were basically the modern day attorney, if you will. So that's all I have for today. I thank you for your attention. We will get into the Sanhedrin next week to finish the religious climate that Jesus was born into. Thank you.